All in this journey together. So until next time.
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is all in the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You're listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR in Rochester. This is episode 73 of Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. I'm also joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Good morning.
And Mary Lawrence.
Good morning.
We have a very packed show today. We are keeping the focus entirely local and talking about two issues in our community that have been going on at least since this week, if not a few before. The first issue we'll talk about in the first half of our hour was, as folks probably have heard about or read about, and that is on Tuesday, the Monroe County Legislature, the GOP part of the Monroe County Legislature, they introduced an act that would really restrict the power of the county executive and expand the power of the legislative branch. Sounds great on principle, right? Because of checks and balances in government and the fact that the executive branch, at least on the national level, has been increasing in power over the past several decades. Well, it is quite interesting of the timing of this because, of course, the Monroe County Executive is now flipping over to the Democratic Party after nearly 30 years, with Adam Bello winning against incumbent Cheryl Donalfo, the Republican, in last week's elections. So we'll spend the first half of our show talking about that. There's a lot to dig into this, and this is a very, very important local issue. And the second hour, we have an entirely different topic.
We'll be talking to Eamon Scanlon, an education policy analyst with the Children's Agenda, about the RCSD budget crisis.
And for those who've tuned into our show before, we'd love it if you could participate in a number of ways. You can give us a call at 585-219-8889. I'll read that one more time, 585-219-8889. This is live radio on Saturday, November 16th. You can also get in touch with us via email at radioeod@gmail.com, and we're on Facebook and Twitter at radioeod. We would love to hear from you. So we should jump right into things because we have a full hour. Do stay tuned about these two very important local issues. Matt, let's take it away.
Shot by Both Sides by Magazine.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. The first half of the hour, we're going to jump into it right now, talking about the Cable Act proposed by the GOP of the Monroe County Legislature. And the second half of the hour,
we'll be talking to Eamon Scanlon about the RCSD budget crisis.
And I will be recusing myself from that conversation. I happen to be professionally very closely aligned with the RCSD, and so I will not be participating in that discussion because it would be inappropriate. So Matt and Mary are going to take over that discussion in the second half of the hour. In the first half, let's go into it right now. Let's set some context. So last week, as we covered in last week's show, there was a local election, and there was, I think all of us agreed at this table at least, there were some surprising results. The Democrats came out on top with a number of key races, most notably in the county executive. That has been controlled by a Republican for the past 27 years. So we're going all the way back to the 1990s. Our whole lives, at least everyone at this table here, literally our whole lives, Monroe County has been run by a Republican. And this is the first time in my life that a Democrat will be in the seat. And so Adam Bello defeated incumbent Cheryl Donalfo, a 52 to 48 percentage. There were also a number of other victories, such as in the Monroe County Legislature. There are 29 seats in the legislature. It was 17 to 12, so 17 Republicans to 12 Democrats. After the elections, that split narrowed, and now it is 15 Republicans to 14 Democrats. So Republicans have a one-seat lead still in the legislative branch. The judicial branch, it doesn't really count because the the district attorney isn't exactly in that branch of government, but the district attorney is still being controlled by Sandra Dorley, and she is the Republican who defeated Channy Curry Mitchell from about a 56 to 44% margin. And so there were a number of other important things that happened in the election, like the Police Accountability Board was approved to 75 to 25. That was sort of a blowout, and that is, really interesting to see when an election like that happens where it's such a wide margin. Mm-hmm. So let's focus now, though, on the executive branch and the legislative branch of our county government, because this is where our story begins. And the timeline is really just the past 4 days. So on Tuesday, in the normal monthly legislative meeting in the Monroe County Legislative Branch, the GOP introduced proposed legislation called the Checks and Balances for Legislative Equality Act. That's known as the Cable Act. This legislation would amend the county charter and administrative code to essentially restrict the power of the county executive and expand the power of the county legislature. So on Tuesday, they introduced this legislation kind of out of nowhere. And not only did they just introduce the legislation, why it was kind of out of nowhere is because they introduced it as a matter of urgency. And that is a phrase that is sort of a legislative option that allows things to be passed quickly if they really are in dire need for the community, and this would bypass the committee process. So normally in the legislative cycle, if you remember from perhaps civics class in high school, normally in legislative branches you have to have the committees, the sort of smaller committees that are, both led by members of both parties. They have to sort of approve legislation before it goes to the main body. Well, with this matter of urgency, it bypassed the committee process and sort of just landed on the floor. And so this happened on Tuesday. On Wednesday, Adam Bello had a press conference and talked to reporters, and he responded to this proposed legislation by the Monroe County GOP and called it a sort of self-serving power grab. And we'll hear a little bit about what Bello had to say. He had more to say, of course. That's sort of the quote that everyone's pulling from his reaction to this. On Thursday, the Monroe County GOP came out and held their own press conference, and they tried to come out and defend what they were trying to do, but they also sort of widened the door and left the door open for maybe delaying the proposal because there was so much community blowback against this. And we'll talk about why perhaps there was so much blowback. Friday, just yesterday, the Monroe County GOP actually rescinded the legislation. So it is apparently, as of now, no longer on the table. And Saturday, of course, today, we're covering it. So it's been a kind of a roller coaster of a week in local politics. Matt, you and I were joking a little bit before, and we were like, boy, it sure is glad that, local politics isn't as divisive as, national politics.
Yeah, I said that in kind of like a hopeful, optimistic, naive sort of way, and that was quickly brought back to reality, I guess.
Yeah, and then this breaks, and you texted me or something, and you were like, whoops,
Yep.
Well, look at that. So this is very interesting. Let's go back to the beginning on Tuesday. So the Monroe County GOP, again, they currently control 17 seats out of the 29 seats in the legislative branch. They will no longer have as much of a majority in January when the new legislature is sworn in, and they will have a 15 to 14 split. Right now, 17. And so they introduced the Checks and Balances for Legislative Equality Act, and what did that act include? Well, it was a number of things that restricted the power of the county executive and expanded the power of the Monroe County legislature. I went through the document, and you can find it online on the Monroe County legislature's website. You just sort of Google that, and all the changes are proposed in red. And these changes would affect, again, the Monroe County Charter and the Administrative Code. So I sort of grouped the changes into 3 categories. That they changed the ability for folks to do staffing, they changed the ability for folks to do their budget, and also to have sort of oversight between the 2 branches, executive and also legislative. And so with staffing, the Monroe County GOP is proposing that they remove the ability for the county executive to create and abolish positions and set compensations for those positions without approval from the Monroe County legislature. So there was sort of a clause in the charter that said, hey, the legislature can allow the executive to appoint their own heads as needed, Well, they're removing that ability for the legislature to even grant the executive that option, and they're also expanding the positions from which the executive has to receive approval from the legislature to appoint people to positions. Not only the heads of departments, but the deputy heads of departments and new positions as well that weren't formally under the scrutiny of the legislative branch. And so that is a new change that would restrict the power of the county executive. There is another change, and so those kind of has to do with staffing. I kind of melded them into one, but that's very significant for how governance works. Other changes, a lot of other ones, have to deal with budget. And so I'll just sort of read them off here. These changes would be granting the power for the county legislature to approve the county purchasing manager's contracting process. So the contracting, if you have what's called a sole source provider, that means there's some proof that the person you want to contract with is the only provider of this service. That helps to sort of make the contracting process move faster. So now, even if the purchasing manager of the county finds and it sort of gets approval for a sole source provider, the county legislature wants to give themselves the power to have to approve that. Also, the public bids process, and this is very important for governance, so when governments sort of put out a request or proposal, hey, we want to get this thing done, who out there can do this thing and we'll pay you money to do it. They're going to now offer all public bids to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Not only that, though, but it has to be approved by the legislature. So again, increasing legislative control over how the budget works and where contract and money and policies are going. They would, and this got a lot of media attention, it would lower the threshold for the county executive to enter into contracts for goods and services from $20,000 to $5,000. So right now, Cheryl Denolfo can enter into contracts from $20,000 or lower without needing legislative approval. This would lower that threshold, so any contract that Adam Bella would enter into that's greater than $5,000 would have to get legislative approval. For some reason, the Department of Environmental Services Director would have to receive legislative approval for railway and freight equipment purchases. I don't know why that's a thing, honestly.
That's the rider.
Yeah, the rider. There's got to be some reason for that. I mean, nothing's an accident in politics, well, in this case. And then the Division of Purchasing and Central Services would have to receive approval from the county legislature to enter into contract as well. So a lot of maybe archaic things and hard to understand for everyday folks there, but basically, again, when you're squeezing the ability to use money, that is very important for how politics works. Increasing the power of the legislature to have oversight over the executive. And last, here's two ones that I didn't see got a lot of attention, but I think are very important. So there was also a clause that the Monroe County GOP proposed, and that would be that if they fulfilled sent a request for information from any county department or the county executive, that the county executive or department would have to respond within 30 days to fulfill their request. That was a clause that was in there, but they didn't have a time deadline on there. So now that response must be fulfilled within 30 days, and if not, I'm guessing they could pursue legal action. And lastly, this is very interesting as well. This would be for the Department of Law, which oftentimes represents the legislature. It would allow the legislature to retain outside counsel when necessary from the Department of Law. I'm guessing, as connected to my previous point, the legislature could more easily get legal defense and take legal action, if necessary, against the county executive. So, those were all of the changes proposed by the Monroe County GOP in this Checks and Balances for Legislative Equality Act. And if you're just tuning in, that's what we're talking about on 100.9 FM WXIR. You're listening to Evidence of Design. Now, why were all of those things important? Because of the timing. So,
this whole event is very reminiscent for me of what happened in Wisconsin last year during the gubernatorial race during the midterms, where Tony Evers defeated incumbent Scott Walker. And then I believe it was 3 weeks before he assumed office, the Wisconsin legislature held a lame duck session in which they passed laws to severely limit the powers of the incoming governor.
Yep.
And I know they also passed laws to limit Wisconsin's early voting access. I believe those were struck down. I'm not sure exactly what happened with Tony Evers' gubernatorial powers. Mm-hmm. But That's immediately what I thought of when I heard about this.
Yeah, Scott Walker's kind of like in scary movies where you think the villain's dead and then he like comes back for one last hurrah, and so he's defeated in an election. You're like, woo, glad that's over. And then
he like jumps out of the boathouse with a machete.
Yeah, and he abolishes the legislative branch entirely or something like that. Yeah.
I want to know if we can do this to Mitch McConnell though.
Yeah, we'll definitely see next year. Is he up for re-election? I'm pretty sure he is.
He is, yeah.
Yeah. So why is this important, Matt? You're getting right at the point. It is because of the timing. So the Republicans have come out with all these changes, and they're phrasing it under the guise of transparency and accountability.
They made the point that in regards to the budget being decreased from 20,000 to 5,000, that Democrats have campaigned on that in the past.
Exactly. So they're saying, look, a lot of these proposals we want to make here, they've been bipartisan here and there for the past several decades, right? Some Democrats have opposed these changes, and so we just want to get them through right now. Well, it urgently, as a matter of urgency in the last 2 months of our Congress here. That does not make much sense to me, and I think it's quite obvious to the community that this is, as Adam Bella said, a blatant self-serving power grab. Because it just seems evident to me that the timing is really odd. Why would you have to go through with this? So actually, let's hear from the GOP. Let's hear from the Monroe County GOP. We're going to hear from Joe Carbone. He's the president of the Monroe County Legislature. He's a Republican. And we're also going to hear from Brian Marionetti. He is the majority leader of the Monroe County Legislature. And again, he's a member of the Republican Party. And so on Thursday of this week, as I talked about in our timeline, the Monroe County GOP really had to come out, and they held a press conference on behalf of this cable act that they're proposing, and they try to sort of defend what they were doing. So we're only going to hear a short 30-second clip of a really fascinating conference that these two gentlemen held. It was very interesting. I wish we could play the whole thing, but radio is not the proper vehicle for it. You'll kind of have to look it up on your own. But Matt, let's hear from both Joe Carbone and Brian Marionetti trying to respond to reporters' question about why do this right now.
Because we want to. We were voted in as the majority. The people kept us as the majority. We can't lose our teeth. We have to have some. We have to have some power to govern. If we let the whole thing go, then why should we be in the majority?
What about the appearances as taking power away from the county executive?
This is not a power grab. This is just one more level of.
It's transparency.
One more level of transparency.
And it's creating the co-equal branches. If I can expand just on what the president was saying, some of the.
Well, it definitely sounds like someone did their homework.
I'm also at a loss for words.
Yeah.
So, again, the reporter's asking...
when you commit a murder, it's good to get your story straight before you go into the interrogation.
The reporter's asking why do this now, and Joe Carbone is responding, again, the president of the Monroe County Legislature. He's a Republican. He's responding like this is not a power grab. The voters voted to make us the majority of the legislature.
And we didn't do anything for our entire...
our
entire thing that we were here, and so now we're going to do something.
Right, and so the reporter pressed him on that in a clip we didn't hear, but she was like, "You've controlled all branches of government for 30 years. Why wouldn't you have done this for 30 years?" And then he sort of flounders and flusters, and he's like, he basically says, "It's not a power grab," but then he says, "We want to hold on to power." So it just, and then he's like, "So why are you doing this?" And then Brian Marionetti chimes in, transparency. He sort of goes for a buzzword that no one can disagree with, like freedom or choice or equality,
or jobs.
Or jobs, yeah, in politics. Like if you ever stutter and you're on a debate stage, just like blurt out one of those 4 words, and the reporter will be like, "Good, yeah, that makes sense. Great, next question." So I'm sorry, I'm being a little too cheeky, but that was really striking to me, and the rest of the clip was very fascinating. I would really encourage you out there, if you're in Rochester or beyond, really Google this. Google the Monroe County GOP's press conference on Thursday of this week. That's Thursday, November 16th, 15th, 14th, Thursday, November 14th. It's on various news outlets locally, and there's a half-an-hour video of that. It's very fascinating how they try to defend this. I also want to read on Thursday of this week, there is a statement by Cheryl Donalfo. She's our current county executive who, again, lost 52-48 to Adam Bello, who's coming in. So this is sort of a long statement. I'll sort of read it directly, but let's skip a little bit. And so this is from Cheryl Donalfo. She submitted this on Thursday of this week. When I took office as county executive on January 1st, 2016, my goal was to always do what I believed is right and in the best interest of the nearly 750,000 residents of our great Monroe County. Last week, when the voters elected a new county executive, I immediately offered assistance to Mr. Bello for a smooth transition. Also elected last week was a Republican majority in the county legislature. Having an open and strong working relationship with the legislature is vital to operating county government. This was never more evident than during the creation of the Office of Public Integrity. And I'll skip her middle paragraph. Her last paragraph ends, again, Cheryl Donalfo. The recently submitted Cable Act of 2019 is another opportunity for the majority and minority office and the new administration to work together in the spirit of bipartisanship and create a working plan moving forward. I am pleased to hear the majority caucus has offered to work with their partners in government on the Cable Act, and I encourage all parties to continue to work together on behalf of the people of Monroe County. So that was Cheryl Donalfo's statement this Thursday in response to the sort of uproar and furor over the Cable Act proposed by the Monroe County Legislative GOP. Something doesn't add up here, and this makes the Republicans look not good. You know, they come out. They take a lot of losses in the recent election, and then they immediately try to sneak through this so-called act that would improve transparency and bipartisanship. But in reality, I think sort of objectively, I don't know, counter-argument, go ahead and counter-argument me at 585-219-8889. That's a new verb, counter-argument me. I'm going to change, is that t-shirt that. So
that's another new verb. T-shirt that.
T-shirt that. Counter argument me. So this is just, it's sort of it's quite obvious what this is all about, and the Monroe County GOP, I think, wants to just sort of hold on to power in a selfless way.
Selfish
way. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Matt, you and I had so the point I really want to end our discussion on until we turn over to a second half of the hour, the point I kind of want to end on is where we're at politics nationally. And I'm really struggling, of course, with a lot of what's been going on in our politics since at least 2016, but definitely beyond that. And I just feel like people aren't being honest about what they're trying to do. And do
you mean there's a lack of transparency?
Yeah, yes. So the issue is people are saying transparency, but they don't mean transparency,
That's how this bill came out. They said this is all about transparency, but they didn't actually say everything that was in it. Mm-hmm. And you have to go and read the actual act in order to find out specifically what they're trying to do.
Yep. And also
which is not transparent.
Right. And it came out as a matter of urgency that wasn't debated in a committee before, the process. Yeah. So you can say right there, it's not transparent. Mm-hmm. And the issue is, where are people's integrity? Do we have integrity anymore? Are we actually operating on behalf of higher values that we all agree to share? Or are we just doing self-interested, short-termed victories that are winner take all? And I'm just really sad to see what's going on in the impeachment process in the House, and folks like Jim Jordan of Ohio and others who are just completely obfuscating the real dire questions that need to be asked. And it's just really sick and sad. And I'm tired of people who are supposed to be leaders in our community being self-serving and lacking integrity. And I have a lot of flaws as an individual, and I'm not up here to sort of do my sermon, but I at least think of myself as someone who tries to live by certain values that I hold dear. And I want to always be someone who has integrity. I want to be a role model to other people through the way I act. I want to be the change I want to see in the world, And I'm sort of sad that I don't see that happening a lot. It's hard to do, but we need to do it. And unfortunately, I'm not finding that anywhere with leaders in our society, and that's very damaging. I feel bad for children nowadays who grow up thinking this is how government and society works. I just feel bad. I look at people's birth dates, and if you were born in 2008, you don't remember. I'm not saying Obama was a saint. That's not what I'm getting at. But all you know now is Trump. And it's what is that doing to you and your idea of living in a society? It's very sad.
Sure. I think you could extend that to the corporate world as well. There's just the entire fabric of our society seems bent around people who know that who will say anything that they can in order to get what they want.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's an exaggeration, but it's draining to have to look for honesty.
And I think being honest becomes draining as well when you're trying to fight against, like you say, when you are trying to approach people who lack integrity or lack honesty with your own honesty. You can't get anywhere because you can't have a productive conversation when you don't trust that the other person is going to hold up their end. And then you feel very isolated, and it just makes people, I think, more frustrated and unable to get anywhere. And, to the detriment of our health as a society and as an environment. There are, we're certainly seeing some consequences that are going to affect us for a long time.
Yep. I think a great and small example is look at what happens to communities when there is a lack of trust between police and residents. It's very damaging and very dangerous, right? When residents can't trust police, and when crimes go sort of uninvestigated, and when innocent people are felt to be persecuted against for no reason. It's very sad when that trust is gone, and I think that's a good example to say what can happen. And this is happening, I think, in a much larger scale and broader in many other aspects of society. So we should end our discussion on the Cable Act proposed by the Monroe County GOP this Tuesday and now rescinded yesterday on Friday. Although this act is rescinded, I would like to just sort of tell people that the next legislative meeting of the Monroe County Legislature is on December 10th. I don't know the exact time, and I should know the place. I'm a good radio host, but you can sort of Google where you can Google where the legislature is meeting. I've been to a few of those before. It's definitely very interesting, and I think useful to see how county government works because it directly affects you, of course. And so again, the next meeting for those folks is on December 10th, and you do have an opportunity to share your voice at these meetings. I think you have to sort of call in or email in or write in what you want to say beforehand. I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong on that, but you can find all that information online at monroecounty.gov, I am sure. And so we're going to end our discussion there at this time. We're going to take a short break, and when we come right back, what are we talking about, Matt?
We're going to be talking about the RCSD budget crisis with Eamon Scanlon, an education policy analyst with the Children's Agenda.
Great. And so I'm affiliated with the RCSD, and therefore I do not think it is appropriate for me to participate in that discussion, so I'll be stepping outside of the studio. Matt and Mary will handle that, and I'll be back at the end of the hour when that discussion is over. So we're going to take a short break right now and be right back on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR.
Not Great Men by Gang of Four.
And welcome back to Evidence of Design on 100.9 WXIR. We are starting the second half of the hour now with the RCSD budget crisis. In September of this year, the Rochester City School District revealed a severe shortfall in its budget. Around $30 million had been overspent. The district superintendent, Terry Dade, has attributed the shortfall to overspending on employee benefits, teacher substitutes, charter tuition, retirement benefits, and contract transportation. Necessities that just weren't really accurately projected in the previous year. Just days ago, district officials announced a plan to reduce staffing by 5% to help fill this budget gap, though it's not yet clear where these cuts are going to be made. We are joined today to discuss the budget crisis by Eamon Scanlon, who is an education policy analyst with the Children's Agenda. Eamon, welcome to Evidence of Design. You are on the air.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So I guess we'll start right ahead. When did it become apparent that there was going to be a budget issue in the RCSD?
Well, this came about because of the district's internal auditors who alerted the new superintendent, Terry Dade, in September and his staff that there was a problem that they were seeing. They had not completed their audit, their review of the year-end books, but they had seen something alarming and they wanted them to know as soon as possible. And since then, since mid to late September, more and more has been revealed until now, where we know not just the problems with last year's budget, but also the potential problems with this year's budget.
Right. And we have sort of, some idea. I mentioned a few reasons that the superintendent had given that could be the possible causes of the budget crisis. Are there other things that may have contributed to it as well?
Well, all of those things contributed to it, but the reason that the budget was under budgeted, overspent, is that when the 2017 during the 2017-18 school year, when the 18-19 budget was being written, there were a lot of different crises that needed to be responded to, and there was a lot of pressure on the administration at the time. Barbara Dean Williams was the superintendent, to increase spending in a lot of different areas. On English language learners, this was after Hurricane Maria, and there was an influx of 560-plus students from Puerto Rico and other hurricane-affected areas, like in Texas. And at the same time, the special ed department was kind of in a meltdown. There was a lot of issues with leadership turnover. So just in general, there were multiple crises and a lot of pressure to increase spending. And so what that seemed to trickle down to was the budget director being pressured to then make a lot of assumptions and move a lot of money around in ways that was not honest, or that would lead to trouble down the road. And so many of those lines and things that were under budgeted and overspent were done so because the projections were wrong, and at the end of the day, they simply did not have the money to cover their bills.
Yeah. How are these budget projections created? Do you have some insight into how the district projects what they're going to spend for the next year?
Well, a little bit. I mean, some of these things are pretty cut and dry. You would go based off of what had happened your last couple years, and you get a general idea of how much something like healthcare or transportation would cost. You factor in how your enrollment changes. There are ways to come up with those numbers, but a lot of that is not made public or is not readily available. And one problem, in fact, if you talk about the charter school tuition, that was under budgeted by about $6 million. And the way that happened was they did not even follow the calculations from the state of how much tuition would go up. And even by their own admission, they said about a few hundred students would be going to charter schools. That should have led to more spending on charter school tuition. But that was never factored in. So in some instances, we see that even by their own numbers and their own understanding, they did not follow the projections they should have.
That sounds like kind of an issue.
Is this a legal issue, Eamon? Is there a potential for people to face prosecution for this sort of thing?
I'm not sure. I think that depends on if you can prove that they knew that they were doing this, and that's the crux of it, right? You could say, well, clearly the budget was underspent, but it's really the difference between incompetence and ill will, doing it purposefully, and they would need somebody to basically prove that through testimony. And it's not clear what will happen around this. From my own analysis, it's pretty obvious that at least the finance department was aware of this as early as probably March of the previous school year, back in March.
Oh, so 2019, this past year?
Yes, okay. March 2019, yes. They would have known about this just based on looking at old reports. You can kind of tease out that they were already over their budget about that time, just slightly, and then things only got worse from there. So that people were clearly aware and hid this. Whether or not that's something that can be prosecuted, that's up to the comptroller's office and other folks in power. It's beyond my pay grade.
Right.
But I would say somebody clearly did something wrong. I would say that.
Yeah. And I guess it is kind of complicated in that this was all done under a different administration, which is not in the picture anymore.
Yeah, that's correct. the current superintendent at least was not here, but all of the board that oversaw at least the last budget are the same, and a lot of the top administrators are the same, although a couple were just let go yesterday. Generally speaking, a lot of the people below the superintendent level and above in terms of the board are the same. And so even though Terry is not, the new superintendent, Terry Dade, is not particularly responsible, there are definitely a lot of people who are still around that could be held responsible.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit. What are some of the possible implications? I know you said it's hard to say at this point, but we do know that the district is planning on having budget cuts and staff cuts in order to fill this gap. What, including that, are some other implications?
Well, I mean, that's basically the implication. It's budget cuts. Because if you don't have the money in your budget, the only way they can really make up revenue other than a couple tricks here or there is to cut staffing. And that's going to have a huge negative impact on schools, on kids in the classroom. There's really no avoiding it at this point unless additional revenue comes from the state. So the district's in a very tough spot right now where to make the cuts they would need to make to fill this gap would be so devastating that they are going to ask the state for a significant amount of money. They're going to ask the city of Rochester to give them some special allowances. They're going to ask the unions to forego a couple special benefits. I mean, a lot of people have to come together and unite and support the district. Otherwise, the cuts that they are facing would simply be destabilizing to the district.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I think I read that the 5% would equal something around 160 to 170 staff positions, which is huge, even in a district this large.
Right, and those numbers are just the teaching positions that it would affect. It would also be cuts to administrators, paraprofessionals. It's a 5% across the board, so that number is closer to a little over 200.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Staff members. And that in total, just for perspective, only adds up to about $9 million. So the gap right now, or the amount of money they would like to recoup by the end of the year, is $64 million. So
wow.
If you were to just try to cut staffing, you would be gutting about 30 to 40% of the total staff of the district.
Right. Yeah. I didn't realize that they were going for $64 million. That's quite a goal. Okay. What are some ways that the RCSD could avoid a similar issue in the future? Obviously, I know right now we're just kind of trying to deal with what's at hand at the moment, but what are some possible things that the school district could do to better budget in the future?
Well, it's really about having honest projections. I mean, much of the trap here was that the budget was compiled in a way that was very complicated. It's been very complicated for many years, and this is how a lot of people were simply unaware of the problem until it was already kind of far too late. And having multi-year projections, not always sort of living in a year-to-year crisis. You have to think about where are we going 2-3 years out, not using little stopgaps year to year to fill things. But I'll say that the transparency piece and the knowledge piece are very important, but I would back up and make sure people understand that it's not that money was misspent on, something corrupt. What you see here was bad budgeting practices to increase money being spent on kids. So, we talk about issues of corruption. There was a city councilman who just recently, I think, went to jail. I forget where that case is right now, but there are a lot of people both in state and local government who have been convicted of corruption charges. This isn't corruption per se. This is mismanagement, and it's mismanagement really that's about hiring teachers. I mean, that's why they have to cut 200 teachers, is because they hired 200 teachers they couldn't afford.
Yeah.
And the bigger conversation is, what is the adequate staffing to really make sure that kids get an adequate education in Rochester? And are we forcing a high-needs district with low property wealth to play games to bump up their staffing to levels that people at the top think is necessary.
I had a question, Eamon, real quick. Is there... You talked about how the school district is sort of applying for aid, I guess, or money from the state. Is there some sort of requirement that they have to meet in order to, or something that the state requires from them in order to get that aid?
Well, this would be a special circumstance, so it's completely up to state lawmakers if or what type of strings they would attach to that. Mm-hmm. They would be asking for money now. The legislative session would not approve additional spending, until they finish their budget at the beginning of April. So at this point, it's sort of a special ask, and that could go a lot of different ways. It really just depends on do state lawmakers agree this is a crisis where they are going to step in, and if they are going to step in with that money, what conditions would they have? And I think it's very likely there will be some conditions attached to this, but it's a little early to say what those will be. And I think that's something that the community should pay really close attention to.
Okay. I guess I was wondering, I know we mentioned a little bit, but haven't really made clear that Rochester is a very high needs district. What are some ways that Rochester is special? Like, why is the budgeting such a big issue in Rochester? Is it just poverty, or are there other things that go into it?
Well, poverty is a huge piece for two reasons. One is that when you have a city that has very low property wealth, there are houses you can buy for $10,000, mm-hmm. Off of North Clinton. When houses are worth so little, the housing stock, and there's just general poverty, the third most impoverished city of its size or bigger in the United States, you don't have a lot in taxes. You don't have a lot to fund schools. And so a community like that is very dependent on the state to make up the revenue that they don't have. The vast majority of funding for RCSD for Rochester comes from the state, about 75%. And that makes them very dependent on the state. And then also, if we think about poverty, there's just a lot that goes with that you need additional supports in the classroom, because poverty comes with a number of challenges in life that make it harder to get to school, to have enrichment activities, just a lot of barriers that are imposed for children. Yeah. And so to really educate children at a level that is equitable, you want to actually spend more on education in impoverished communities than you would in a wealthy district like a Pittsford or a Brighton. Mm-hmm. So those are the two sides of it. They're very dependent on the state to have enough money to educate children, and really they need more. They need more than most communities for it to be adequate.
Yeah. Eamon, could you talk a little bit before we wrap up, could you talk a little bit about what your organization, the Children's Agenda, does?
Of course. And the Children's Agenda has been around for 15 years. We really look at how public money supports children, from cradle to career. And my work in particular is on the city school district. And that's core to our mission, because we focus on children that are most affected by both poverty, trauma, health disparities, and racism. And those are very prevalent in the city school district. And I, every year for the last couple of years, have put out an analysis of the city school district budget. And we also have a blog that I've been doing to kind of more explain the crisis. People can find that on the website, thechildrensagenda.org. And there'll be more coming now that we know a little bit more about the totality of the crisis. But our work is really advocacy. It's how do we make sure dollars are spent in the best way to support kids, and that there's enough being spent on kids, because they can't advocate for themselves. They really need the voice of the community to rise up for them.
That sounds like a great mission. Is there anything else you would like to let our listeners know?
Yeah, so in all of this, if you're really concerned about the budget crisis, the people you should be lobbying are your state legislators, people in the state assembly and the state senate, assembly more so. But those are the ones who are going to make the decision that's really going to get relief. people are frustrated with the school board, but the money flows through the state. So get out, look up your state representative, and send a letter if you're very concerned.
Okay. Eamon, thank you so much for joining us. Again, listeners, if you are looking for more information about the budget crisis, you can find Eamon's blog on thechildrensagenda.org. Eamon, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And I think we're going to take another quick break here, and let's take it away, Matt.
The Forgotten Capital by Nobu Uematsu.
And this is Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR.
Jason, you're back.
I am back. So in the first half of the hour, we talked about the Cable Act, that is the checks and balances for legislative equality. That was an act proposed by the Monroe County Republican Party in the Monroe County Legislature. They proposed that on Tuesday to revise some of the county charter and administrative code to essentially curtail the power of the county executive and expand the power of the county legislature. We talked about how odd that timing was now that, Republicans have controlled branches of government in Monroe County on the county level at least, for 30 years nearly. Why they would propose those changes now, seeming to target the new Democratic executive administration coming in. And in the second half of the hour,
we were joined by Eamon Scanlon, an education policy analyst with the Children's Agenda, to talk about the RCSD budget crisis.
And I do just want to mention again, if you want more information about the budget crisis, Eamon has a blog on thechildrensagenda.org that you can read up about.
And I happen to be employed by the district, so that's why I did not participate in that discussion, because I found that would be inappropriate, and none of my sort of comments or views or anything that you folks, Matt or Mary, talked about, I'm not weighing in on any of that because that would be inappropriate. So we can wrap up our show today. Should we zoom out of the local and zoom into the national? That was lamer than I
I don't know if you can really zoom into something bigger. You need a drone.
It's an exploded view. We have, I guess, just a few minutes to make some informal, or less formal rather, comments on the last week concerning the impeachment process. And I think taking it back to what you were talking about earlier, Jason, about trying to find integrity in today's society, it has just been such a stark reminder for me seeing the reaction from and the questioning conducted by many of the Republicans on the impeachment panel. It's been such a reminder because of that how fragile democracy is, how necessary and important it is that in order for it to work, we must all engage honestly and openly with the same set of facts. And it just takes a small group of influential people saying this isn't how this really is, or denying the reality of a situation in order to fundamentally alter the very way in which our government operates. And that's terrifying, and I'm not sure where to go from there.
Yeah, I don't know either. Like I said, Matt, I've been thinking a lot about the word integrity, and it goes back to a lot of the things that I sort of learned about as a kid, Integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. And I guess you can debate about different moral principles, but I think for the most part, everyone's kind of got the same golden rule, right? Treat other people the way you want to be treated. Do you want people to lie to you? Do you want other people to take advantage of you? I don't think so. And I'll go there again. Mary or Matt, you might roll your eyes every time I talk about Merrick Garland and how Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans on a national stage would refuse to even have the hearing on Merrick Garland, who was Obama's sort of nominee for filling Antonin Scalia's seat on the Supreme Court. McConnell didn't even hold a hearing for that, and that's sort of a huge red flag as well, where it's like, what's going on here? How do you debate with that in a society? And it's just really sad that that's happening in other places where we're just not doing what we're supposed to be doing.
I don't think there's anything to roll your eyes at. That's why I was saying we should try and grab Mitch McConnell's power, because he certainly has too much when saying, I'm not going to hear this issue because Democrats pulled it up. brought it up. That's not
okay.
It's not democratic.
Right. And I would hope, exactly, it's not democratic, not the Democratic Party. And I would hope that the Democrats, I would be mad at the Democrats if they did the same to Republicans. And that's the difference, where it's not okay. This isn't just wrong because Republicans did it. It'd be wrong if Democrats did it too. And that's where we need to get at, where that's sort of integrity, right? At least part of it. And so we can go on.
We should wrap it up there.
Yeah, we can end it right there. And thanks, folks, for tuning in this hour to episode 73 of Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR.
And thanks again to Eamon Scanlon, who joined us on the second half of this show.
We are always live on Saturdays from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m.
Not true.
And most of the time live, sometimes. But we're most of the time live on Saturdays. Integrity, yeah. The difference. But you can find our past episodes on YouTube. You can search for the Evidence of Design channel. You got to be specific with your search because we don't have enough viewers yet to be up there on the top of your search bar. So Evidence of Design episode X, 1 through 20 will pop up for you there. And you can check out any of our past 72-ish episodes. And stay in tune with us throughout the week. Email us, evidenceofdesign. No, I'm sorry, that's our old one. Email us at radioeod@gmail.com. Again, radioeod@gmail.com. We're on Facebook and Twitter at radioeod as well. I was your host, Jason Taylor. Joined by my good friends and co-hosts, Matt Treadwell.
Farewell.
And Mary Lawrence.
Have a lovely day.
Be well, be safe. We'll see you next week. And bye-bye.